Happy Monday, folks. Welcome back to WWE Network and Chill, where every single Monday right here on the show, I, Graham Giason Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the network. And today we're talking the Creative Committee episode of Table for Three that aired last week after Raw on the WWE Network, featuring Eric Bischoff, Jim Cornette, and Michael P.S. Hayes. It was every bit as good and every bit as entertaining as it sounds. The first time ever that Bischoff and Cornette have met face-to-face. They did talk about briefly, at least Cornette did, who did most of the talking in this episode, which was to be expected and still to be enjoyed as well. He did talk about the one interaction they did have, I think over the phone or something, at like Spring Stampede 3 or something, like many, many years ago, back in the early WCW days, the early territory days. Maybe not the early territory days, but we're going back like 2 or 3 decades here. But beyond that, shockingly enough, Bischoff and Cornette have never met face-to-face. They've heard quite a bit about each other. They talk about the miscommunication, misrepresentation between the two, and how when they've come face-to-face, they've come to like each other, and that they find out they have more alike than they do different, including sharing a hate for Vince Russo. You know you can have a Jim Cornette show, whether it be a podcast. I don't think he mentioned Vince Russo in the WWE Hall of Fame speech, the induction speech for the Rock and Roll Express a couple months ago. I don't think he did, but he did here, and I laughed my ass off. Vince Russo tweeted about it. No, fuck that clown, but still, sharing hate for Vince Russo I thought was wonderful. They talk about where they found talent in their respective companies early on, many years ago, when they first started getting into the business, where talent came from, and how it kind of relates to today. And speaking of which, they talk all about how the business has changed. Now, the interesting thing about this is that you have Cornette, who does a wrestling podcast about today's business, as does Bischoff, and then you have Hayes, who is working on the inside as a producer. So he can kind of shine some light on some of the angles and storylines that WWE is doing right now, and general criticism and thoughts on it and stuff like that, which I'll talk about at the end. They had some interesting thoughts on like Roman Reigns and Samoa Joe and people like that, which I'll talk about towards the end. But they talk about how the business has changed dramatically, how people generate heat, they know how to be hated. Cornette says one of the big things that he did not like about WCW was the fact they had cool heels, and that like the NWO went for being cheered rather than being booed, which is true. And I think Hayes might have said that, where there's a difference between like being absolutely cheered and then just being a tweener. They talk about that quite a bit. Bischoff talks about doing things differently in WCW as opposed to being in WWE, which he's talked about a million times, but it's always fascinating to hear about his rise during the Monday Night Wars in the late 90s and how he crafted WCW into the mega monster it was for many years. Like I already talked about the Cornette not liking the cool heels and how over-the-top wrestling had become and stuff like that. So Hayes asks Cornette what his favorite creation was, and obviously he says the Midnight Express, in the not the Rock and Roll Express, indeed the Midnight Express. It was the rivals of the Rock and Roll Express, obviously. But he also said he enjoyed his time as a commentator, which I did not know he did commentary. I know he probably did commentary for OVW, which he was in charge of for many years in the early 2000s, but what I did not know was that he did commentary for the first ever SmackDown episode in '99, the SmackDown pilot, again, which I had no idea about, so that was news to me. You probably already knew that. I did not, so I thought that was pretty cool. Michael Hayes talks about his time being an agent, enjoying it, how he was told, like in the late 90s, I think he had done something in the late 90s, like to reform the Freebirds. It didn't work. He tried to manage the Hardy Boys. That didn't work. So then he was kind of sad to become an agent, but then he kind of took a pleasure in it after a while, and really the pride and the pride he takes in having that job. But he does bring up specifically one match he absolutely loved, that he praises beyond belief, as he should, obviously. The Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels. He talks about how they crafted the match, what went into it. Really interesting stuff to hear from an agent perspective. We heard, Michaels talk about it, other people talk about it, but never like the agent, which was pretty cool. So I loved hearing about that. Michael Hayes says, which I'm not the biggest Michael Hayes fan, but he does make a great point here. He is quoted in saying, "Enjoy the journey, and the destination is going to be fun too," which I could not agree more with. That was a pretty cool quote. We also hear Cornette saying that, here's the thing. So going into the next segment, Michael Hayes says this, and this was recorded over WrestleMania weekend, obviously. So the topic here is, what WrestleMania match would you want to see next year in New Orleans at WrestleMania 34? All 3 matches that they gave here were fucking great. They were all great options. Cornette says that he would want to see a submission match between Brock Lesnar and Samoa Joe. Fucking sign me up. That sounds tremendous. Would love to see that. Bischoff thinks that Roman Reigns will be a heel by next year and face AJ Styles in a rematch from last year's Extreme Rules match, Payback match, which would also be great. And interestingly enough, they just talk about Hayes or they talk about Roman Reigns, and now Hayes says that he agrees that he probably should be a heel, and that he has the same Cena dynamic where like the women are cheering for him and the guys are booing him, and there were different times where they thought they should have turned Cena, but he's had that longevity. So based off what PS was saying, and he made it sound like they're never going to turn Roman, which fucking sucks. It's not the same thing as Cena. Cena, for as annoying as he was, he still had some likable characteristics about him. Roman is just a fucking douche. The guy is just a piece of shit sometimes. So I gotta disagree there. I do agree to an extent, but it's not exactly the same thing as John Cena. It's not quite, that Roman Reigns is in a much worse position in my opinion. But anyway, speaking of which, Michael Hayes says that he would want to see John Cena versus Roman Reigns, which is going to happen at some point anyway, whether it be next. There's a pretty good possibility it could happen next year, but it could happen the year after that too. I think it's going to be Roman and Brock next year, but I could also see it being Cena and Reigns too if they play their cards right. And then Cornette says, "You're not quite as bad as I thought you were," to Bischoff to close out the episode. And then Bischoff says, which got a chuckle out of me, he says, "Just give it time, let's order dessert, and then I'll get back to you afterwards," which is pretty funny. And they shake hands to close out. Cornette and Bischoff just shake hands to close out the episode. So again, really enjoyed it. Creative Committee on the WWE Network from Table for Three Creative Committee. So check out that show on the network from last Monday, from after last Monday's Raw. Thoroughly enjoyed this episode. Check it out when you can. It's only about 19 minutes, but it goes by like that. Like it just breezes by. And I love those Table for Three shows for that just alone. They just go really, really quickly. They're fun viewing. There's some things you don't know yet. There's news to you. That's like news to you. So again, enjoy the episode. Check it out when you can. And that does it, guys, for my review of Creative Committee episode of Table for Three from last week. So be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, subscribe to the channel, above all else, for daily content right here on the channel. And we'll be back next Monday with another all-new episode of WWE Network and Chill. But until then, guys, I'm Graham G.S. Matthews. Have a great week, and I'll catch your ass down the road.